Everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee on Comprehensive Job Creation Plan. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. I'm joined by my colleagues, Mr. Harris Dawson, Mr. Blumenfield, and Mr. Wesson, and we are ready to begin with our agenda item today. Before we take up item number one and bring up our staff, I will take cards. So let's go ahead and do, I'm going to go ahead and do general public comment and item number one at the same time. So we'll start with Mr. David Jetty, who will be followed by Patricia McAllister. Yes, it'll be 1 minute and then 1 minute for general public comment, too, for those who are signed up for general public comment. So 1 minute for Mr. Jetty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here in support of the process that the city is going through exploring the creation of a public bank for Los Angeles. Public Bank LA and other public banking advocates are very confident that a public bank will reduce the cost of credit to the city, will provide opportunities to the unbanked, including industries which are currently shut out of the banking world. And we believe that the city has the power to found this bank under its constitutional municipal affairs powers. We've submitted quite a bit of documentation to the committee, and we hope that you have looked it over. We want to also bring your attention to a statewide effort to ask the Department of Business Oversight to create a special public banking license which will address some of the specific legal and regulatory issues that I'm sure you are reviewing and discussing today. This is an effort that we prefer that the city get behind. We ask that you resolve to support such proposed legislation and to consider this when looking at these regulatory issues. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, Ms. McAllister. I'm sorry, 1 second, please. Yes, so 1 minute on the item and 1 minute on general public comment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm concerned about this private state bank because here you say it's going to help homelessness and businesses, local businesses. My concern is you could be washing drug money also, cocaine and crack and prostitution. I don't trust you guys. And then you threw homelessness in there. What is the bank going to do with homelessness? That has nothing to do with homelessness. You need to be trying to get these 5 million illegal aliens out of this affordable housing. Now, in this report, you said that it says that Council File number 170831, it's a confidential legal analysis. So the legal department has created this legal analysis and called it confidential. Well, nothing is confidential in public here, so I want a copy of that. Okay, I want a copy of that legal analysis of this bank because I'm against this because I don't trust you guys. I believe you're stealing now, and that bank's going to be a mess. All kinds of money are going to be stolen out of that bank, and I don't want to see you guys go to prison, which most of us would like to see, I'm sure.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Herman, followed by Mr. Spindler.
In most cases, you already know that banks are robbed. Banks offer interest to rob you. The same way this condition that the city of Los Angeles has asked for you to participate in helping them steal public funds. How dare you say that this bank is the interest of the public? We are the legislative body of the Ralph M. Brown Act, and we disagree. We are all in opposition of this unfair practice of a deficit ceiling you're creating. Stop stealing from the public. So I have to wear a hood. You can't see me, but I'm wearing a white hood with two big eyes because I can see where the money is going. Patting politicians with big wet diapers. Now my general public comment. Now, as you know, as all of you have heard, I was called multiple items of things by Nuri, today in general public comment. She accused me of saying that I was attacking
Yeah, that's
women.
not within the jurisdiction of this committee, so you're
I'm
out of
talking
order.
about the money on prostitution.
You're out
and
of order.
banking.
You're out of order, sir.
I'm
That's
not
your
out of
last
order, so I
warning.
got
You can speak
43
to something
seconds.
within the jurisdiction of this committee, or you're done.
So, when it comes to predatory banking, regulatory stealing, abuse, fraud, waste, you were better off paying all those pre-settlements than having to incur and occur damages, punitive damage and compensatory damages. And you're right, Mr. Dawson. Fuck Krikorian and the budget, and fuck the city of Los Angeles for fucking with people like Wayne Spindler and Armando Herman. Fuck you.
Mr. Spindler, followed by Leah Renee Memzik.
So we get first to the fucking item number 1. Well, it's the only item on the one. On the item 1, October the 4th, you want to make a state-chartered bank. Yes, read the opinion. Does the 10th Amendment support a bank that violates federal law by sinking the fucking money into dope? No! Page 4 of the opinion, counsel. So, of course, nobody here has a law degree. Nobody here gives a fucking shit about the law. You just like be a little toy, a little kid, and you just have a temper tantrum. I want a bank. I want to make my own bank. I don't give a shit if it's illegal. I just want my bank. I want to have my own bank. And of course, you'll just do whatever the fuck you want because your city attorney lets you do it. And that's why the general public comment is talking about Mike Fuhrer. Mike Fuhrer is an enabler. Mike Fuhrer is violating the city charter by violating state and federal law every fucking day. He lets you, enables you to violate the law. This bank is illegal. You cannot put this fucking bank together because Herman Jason Wesson is a racist and a criminal, and you cannot have a bank formed by criminals. After all, the criminals are in Washington. It's called the FDIC. I have my money in an FDIC bank. What the fuck is going to insure your bank? What, pimps and prostitutes? They're not bonded, stupid. So you can't get money from hoes and bitches. Finally, fuck you.
Our next speaker is Leah Renee Memzik, followed by Farmars Nabari.
Hi, Leah, item number 1. I'm very concerned about the City of Los Angeles, the City Council person's desire to create a state-chartered public bank in the name of the City of Los Angeles. If your own council person, the president, Herb Wesson, can't even show up, actually, he left, for the record, just let everyone know that
No,
he
you
got
need
up
to
and
speak
left.
to the item.
I am speaking on the item. He's not even here, and he's listed as being here. Mitchell Englander isn't here either. And the problem is that the City
Hold
of
your
Los
time for a minute. Mr. Herman, sit in silence or you'll be removed. This is Ms. Memzik's time to speak. You're done speaking. If I hear you again, you're out of this room. I guarantee it. Go right ahead.
So I have come to learn that the City of Los Angeles is violating federal statutes. I think it's 1961. It's racketeering. The predicate offense is obstruction of justice and wire fraud and mail fraud. And so I don't even understand how you could even consider a state-chartered public bank when you don't even take care of the issues that are right there in front of you. Like, for example, you have a lawsuit from the United States of America suing the City of Los Angeles for $100 billion because you took $995 million you took in federal grants for the disabled, and and they're gone. You never used them for the disabled. And so now you have a lawsuit for fraud. And so if you're going to lose $1 billion of federal money, how are you going to honestly handle the people's money? So I ask you to object and deny this request to put in a public bank in the people's name of the City of Los Angeles.
All right, thank you very much. No, you had 2 minutes. Our next speaker is Farmars Nabari, and that's Mr. Herman is disrupting the meeting. Please ask him to leave. He's done.
Council members, Krikorian and Blumenfield, thank you very much for putting this proposal on the agenda. I'm a Valley resident. I know both of you represent the San Fernando Valley and also the entire city of Los Angeles. I'd like to speak in support of the establishment of a public
hold
bank.
his time, please. Mr. Herman continues to disrupt the meeting with racist taunts as he walks out, disrupting the speaking time of a member of the public who came to talk about the business before us. In fact, can you please start his time over again? I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Council Member. As I said, I'm a resident of the San Fernando Valley. I'm very much in support of this proposal for a public bank for several reasons. One, because it protects us as taxpayers by making sure that the benefit that comes from banking comes back to the city rather than going to a corporation like Wells Fargo. But more importantly, I think this can be a vital tool for addressing the current housing shortage that we have, that we can leverage our public funds to create more low-cost, affordable housing, whether it's through the city, whether it's through nonprofits, whether it's through cooperatives, or through the private sector. We desperately need more housing, and this can be a part of that. So I want to express my support for this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other cards on this item? Okay. Then I'd like to go ahead and invite up the CLA and City Attorney to the front table. So when last we met, we felt that it was important to have a review of some of the potential legal constraints that there might be in establishing a municipal bank. And I know that you've all had an opportunity to review the state of the law, review some of the things that are being developed in other jurisdictions. And I think we should probably ask the CLA to start, and then we'll go to the city attorney. So,
okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. John Wickham with the Office of Chief Legislative Analyst, and I'm joined by Alex Whitehead with the CLA's office as well. In the report that we prepared, we were asked to look at the legislative solutions that might be necessary in order to address the question of a municipal bank. As we got into some of the details here, we determined that the information, in order to make a determination on that fact and make recommendations on legislation, we really needed to know more about the structure of the bank that would be moving forward, a more detailed set of criteria. And so, is this a commercial bank structure that we're using? Is this a credit union type structure? Is there a public bank structure? What kinds of services would be provided? Would it be receiving deposits? Would the city funds be going into it? There are a lot of criteria, and the legal framework that would need to be adjusted depends on those criteria. So we needed to have the cart and the horse in the right order in order to move forward and make some recommendations on that. And then subsequent to the release of our report, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area released a report that provided a really substantial analysis of municipal banking. And I think it would behoove us to dig into this a little bit more, so we'll need a little extra time to take a look at the analysis that they have put together and see how that affects the legislative framework that needs to be addressed. So basically, we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode. Our next report that we've been asked to provide talks more about the potential structures and framework for a municipal bank. So when we bring that forward to you at your next meeting, that will guide us better in what kinds of legislative solutions we might seek.
Okay, very good. And that next meeting, members, will be on January 24th. And at that time, we'll be able to take additional actions based on the information that is presented both at this meeting and the next. Yeah, sure, go ahead, Mr. Wesson.
I was at a hearing not that long ago, and in this hearing we were dealing with regulations on cannabis. And one or two of the Native American tribes were here and testified. I'd like to, Mr. Chair, find out if they have banks, because they thought that given their sovereignty, I'd just like if we could get some kind of a report where it relates to what rules and regs might apply to them. Is there possibilities of partnerships or something? So before I forgot that, I just wanted to throw that out because I found that to be just very interesting. And I don't know if they already have banks, if so, how they operate. What does sovereignty mean where it relates to the banking industry?
At the October meeting, the committee had asked that our office look at international models for municipal banking, and we're doing that research, and so that request fits in exactly with the report that we're moving forward. So that will be part of that report.
Thank you.
The other part of the report that we've released, and Alex is prepared to describe that, is that the State Treasurer, John Chang, has released a report regarding cannabis banking, and there are they've done a substantial amount of research and work on this subject matter, so Alex is prepared to provide a summary of that report at this time.
Council members?
Great, thank you. And just because I want to always make sure that our record is clear on this, before we begin that discussion, I do just want to reiterate that there are at least two completely separate sets of issues here. One is, what are the policy and legal constraints and opportunities in developing a municipal bank owned or controlled or initiated in some way by the City of Los Angeles? That's one distinct set of issues. A separate, distinct set of issues is, if that were to happen, what would be the constraints or opportunities in having such an institution service depositors and others who may be related to the cannabis industry. So I want to always make sure that we're talking on those two separate tracks, but with regard to that cannabis issue, since we've already started to do some of this work, Mr. Whitehead, maybe you can bring us up to speed on that.
Thanks, council members. On November 7th, 2017, the California State Treasurer's Office released the report Banking Access Strategies for Cannabis-Related Businesses, which outlines the difficulties arising in the banking industry due to the conflict of cannabis legality between federal and state laws. The report states that the industry is, at this time, largely locked out of the banking system because of the legal and financial liability incurred by banks that work with cannabis dispensers. The report outlines key issues and potential strategies in 4 different areas: the cash handling for collection of taxes and fees, expanding cannabis industry to banking services under current law, the feasibility of creating a public or private financial institution to serve cannabis businesses, and developing a strategy to change federal law and remove obstacles to cannabis banking. The Treasurer's recommendations regarding the creation of a public financial institution outlines a number of potential issues that could arise if Los Angeles proceeds with the creation of a public bank. A public financial institution, which would be organized and capitalized by the state and owned by the taxpayers of California, could serve one of 2 purposes, or both. Finance public infrastructure and expand banking for underserved groups, which could include the cannabis industry, and or take deposits, make loans, and provide other services primarily to cannabis industries alone. The report describes how the establishment of such an institution comes with a variety of roadblocks. From legislative processes to physically establishing banking locations, a public financial institution would take years to organize. But with recreational cannabis becoming legal on January 1st, any institution would be years behind serving its customers. The state also would be forced to self-insure a public financial institution, creating a large amount of liability without federal backing. Losses would also likely be substantial at the onset of the institution, requiring years of taxpayer subsidy. The Treasurer recommends that a feasibility study be conducted to determine whether the creation of a public financial institution is advisable for California given the significant costs, benefits, risks, and regulatory issues. The report also notes that the only true solution to cannabis banking difficulties is the removal of federal legal and regulatory roadblocks on cannabis. According to the report, this would actually allow for cannabis to be treated like other cash-intensive regulated industries and grant financial institutions freedom to back state legal cannabis businesses. The Treasurer recommends that a multi-state consortium be created among representatives of cannabis legal states, the cannabis industry, and law enforcement. This consortium would focus on education and outreach of the cannabis banking problem, maintain a central repository for California state cannabis law information, and advocate congressional and executive branch policy. This consortium would act as one collective voice for common sense cannabis banking law reform.
So that went by kind of quick. It's okay. I mean, it was good. It was to the point, but just to be clear, Sacramento is grappling with the same issue. What you were reading from was the Treasurer's report about options that would be before state policymakers in chartering a state-run bank. Is that right? Just so I was clear on
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So since Los Angeles would have to operate presumably within the restrictions of state law, the challenges that the state itself would have would be perhaps even greater for a municipality that was seeking to operate within that same construct. And I think it sounds as though all of the issues you mentioned would at least equally apply to the city. The length of time it would take to get up and running, and the regulatory uncertainty, and imposition of potential federal sanctions, and all those other issues. If the state is struggling with that, then certainly we would be struggling to at least as great an extent.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Were you done with your presentation? Okay. So thank you, Mr. Wickham. Anything else?
No, that's
Okay. So let's go then to the city attorney. I know that we do have before you the legal opinion that was prepared, that was referenced earlier for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area. I know that our city attorney's office has begun to take some broad strokes looks at this as well. So I'd like to ask Ms. Vincent to go ahead and present on this as well.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm Noreen Vincent from the City Attorney's Office, and I'm joined here this afternoon with my colleagues Gretchen Smith from our Public Finance section and Charles Hong also from our Public Finance section. So I think one of the things that we were looking at as we're beginning to develop our opinion and what we can do in this area, as you've indicated, is sort of a new area, and we're charting new territory with respect to establishing a municipal bank and also the issue of accepting deposits from cannabis. At your previous meeting, I believe that we talked about the fact that the restrictions that may apply to the state and to counties with respect to not loaning their credit arguably do not apply to the city of Los Angeles, as we are a charter city, and so we don't run into the same restrictions that are in the Constitution and in state law that limit counties from being able to establish municipal banks. However, there are sections of the government code that do apply to the city with respect to where and how we can deposit our funds, and the state basically has taken the position that the deposit of money, whether it's by the city, the county, is a matter of statewide concern, and therefore has taken the position that even though we're a charter city, those sections of the government code do apply to us. So there are limits in terms of the type of bank into which we can deposit our funding, requiring certain collateralization, certain liquidity, certain insurance to guarantee our funds. And the way in which we can deposit our money is subject to the prudent investor rule, which basically means that as we're making the decisions into what vehicles we're going to place our money, it's up to the treasurer or who's ever making that decision to make sure that we are looking at the liquidity, the collateralization, and the rate of return. Those are the three things that are called out for a prudent investor. And as the prudent investor, the treasurer and as well the city council members who are involved wind up being fiduciaries with respect to the safeguarding of city money.
Okay, so before you go further on that, let me just kind of recap some of this. So counties and other subordinate governments within California have a specific statutory prohibition on creating a banking institution that you believe would not necessarily apply to a city because we're a charter city.
Yes,
right?
that's correct. Based on our research to date, we do not believe that those restrictions would be applicable to us.
Okay.
But we are, I just want to emphasize, in the preliminary stages of looking at these issues. So, but based upon our research thus far.
Just follow up on
yeah.
on that. When you said the restriction, as you said, it was about loaning your credit, was the exact words you used, right?
I'm sorry.
You said the restriction has to do with loaning your credit.
Correct.
Could you go into that a little bit more? Because I think it's not a prohibition on creating a bank, it's a prohibition on loaning your credit, which is slightly different, right?
Correct. So I'm going to ask Gretchen Smith, who actually has those specific sections.
Hi, this is Gretchen Smith from the City Attorney's Office. The sections that Noreen is referring to specifically are the California Constitution, Article 16, Section 6, which basically prohibits the state from lending its credit. It's a very long section, and we have it available. We can make it available to anybody who wants to look at it. But the other section is California Government Code Section 23007, which essentially prohibits a county from loaning its credit or giving aid to persons or individuals.
Could you elaborate what that means exactly, loaning your credit? Because I can imagine a couple of different things.
Well, basically at this point, what it actually means from our legal analysis isn't necessarily relevant to us because we're saying these are not applicable to us, but it would probably, in theory, operate to keep you from opening a bank. Because if you're putting city money in there and then you're going to loan it out, making loans basically. But we're saying those two sections do not expressly apply to us. And as charter cities, we're saying that while the county may well be prohibited and the state may well be prohibited, we don't feel we are restricted from those particular sections. However, what Noreen was getting at is all the other state laws that we would need to consider, and there's federal laws that we would need to consider as well. Some of those laws actually do expressly include the City of Los Angeles, and one of those such laws involves the rules and regulations that relate to the deposit of public funds into any type of bank. And we've analyzed those laws, for instance, and I don't know how far you want to go in this. There is a question as to whether, there is really no question as to whether those laws do apply to us. They expressly do cover charter cities. So to clarify, I think the two things that were at issue at the last meeting where I was not at, the issue of the California constitutional prohibition and the issue of Government Code Section 23007 restricting the city. We are comfortable saying at this time those are not restrictions that we would feel tied our hands as a municipal entity. With regard to other laws, there are many, many other laws that would need to be analyzed.
And first of those is, in order to create a banking institution, there must be some capitalization, there has to be something to create it with, and that would presumably be with some public funds. And if there's a single dollar of public funds put into any institution, new or old, new or existing, then the prudent investor rule would apply to restrict where we can put that money. Is that right?
That is correct.
So even an existing banking institution, if we wish to put our depository accounts with an existing banking institution, we still are obligated by the prudent investor rule and our fiduciary duties surrounding the public's.
That is correct. Those are the factors that I identified are those that must be considered when we're looking for investments or deposits for city funds. And the violation of the prudent investor rule could potentially result in personal liability.
Okay, so what are some of the elements of the prudent investor rule then?
The prudent investor rule requires that we look to make sure that there's preserving the capital, ensuring adequate liquidity, and obtaining a sufficient rate of return are the three factors that need to be considered when looking at the prudent investor rule.
Okay. So, you know what? I took you off track and started interrupting you.
That's
go right
okay.
ahead and go ahead and finish your report, and then we'll come back to it.
So I think what we were really looking at is that there are certain restrictions and limitations on where the city can deposit its money and what can be done, what kind of vehicles the money can be placed into. And again, I think looking at what the bank would be formed for, the organization, the structure, the purpose, what we would be looking to do with the money, how we would capitalize it, those are all questions I think that remain to be answered and may impact the analysis. I think that one of the other areas that we looked at was the ability of this institution to receive deposits from cannabis-related businesses. And I think that what we've concluded at this point is that we are in no different position than a traditional nationally chartered bank with respect to accepting deposits from businesses that we know are marijuana businesses. And there is a lengthy process that the institutions have to go through. Under the Obama administration, there was advice issued, guidelines provided in terms of under what circumstances a bank could accept money from cannabis. And we would be subject to those same rules. That was not statutory. Those were merely guidelines, and it's really unclear at this point as to whether the current administration would continue to follow those guidelines. And if you'd like, I can ask Gretchen to go into a bit more detail in terms of what that would require us to do.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, even though it's likely moot. I think it's helpful to understand what the state of the law was and how restrictive it was even under the Obama administration, and then we can assume, I think safely, that not every administration will have the same view of this subject, and the current one may view things more draconian, in a more draconian fashion. So, but go right ahead.
So essentially, cannabis remains, throughout the Obama administration and under the current administration, to be classified as a Schedule I drug under federal law. And what that means to us is the business industry related to cannabis remains potentially at risk of federal prosecution for violations of the Controlled Substances Act. Where we as a city municipality might run into trouble is if we were to establish a bank that were to accept deposits from the cannabis industry. That could potentially run afoul of the Banking Secrecy Act. And essentially that could expose the city, any employees, anybody making decisions about investing money in such a bank to potential liability. I'm sorry, 1 minute. Okay. So basically, if we were a bank and not just as a municipal entity, there are certain rules that were, guidelines actually, that were set into place that the Obama administration, through 2 different memos that I won't go into detail on, they basically provided a procedure whereby a bank could, in theory, do business with a cannabis-based industry. The requirements that they imposed on the bank were very, in our opinion, pretty onerous, in that any time there's any type of deposit made, an excessive, actually any type of deposit for cannabis-related money, the bank has very intensive paper requirements it has to do. It has to do an extensive background check on all the people that are involved in the process in that business that wants to conduct cannabis-related transactions. They need to make sure there's no criminal convictions. They need to make sure that they do what's called customer due diligence. And it's a very exhaustive list, but basically they need to be satisfied and certify essentially to the federal government that the person that they're doing business with is not actually in a money laundering situation, for lack of a better explanation. So they'd have to fill out paperwork. Assuming that the bank could be satisfied that the persons that they're dealing with are not higher level criminals than just being involved in what the federal government continues to see as illegal activity, they would fill out what's called a suspicious activity report. There's 3 tiers. The tier 1, or the lowest level, is where the bank notifies the federal government, we've received these funds from a cannabis-based business. We believe that these funds are in accord with what a cannabis-based business should be doing, and we don't have any reason to suspect there's additional illegal activity. So assuming that a business continues to transact in a way that the bank considers as normal, and the bank would need to become basically a functional auditor of that type of business and make sure that it's really reasonable to keep, that the bank is not doing anything in addition to marijuana activities. An example would be if they know the business models that should generate $30,000 a month, it in fact generates $50,000 a month. Under the FinCEN and Cole Memo guidelines, the bank would then be responsible for flagging this and sending it to the feds and saying effectively, well, you need to maybe look at this because they're making more money than they should be making. That would then kick it up to what's called a Tier 2 suspicious activity report. And you'd have to do an additional investigation. The bank would need to really conduct a thorough vetting of the process and decide that the banking activity was in fact normal. It would have to tell the feds about it. In the event that the activity revealed that they thought that there was additional activity going on that was illegal in excess of just regular cannabis-based business, then the bank would be in the position of notifying the authorities that they had kind of a red flag, a Tier 3 situation. They would have to eventually stop doing business with that bank. Potentially they'd have to tell everybody in the neighborhood, in the area, that they can't do business with that bank. So there's just a lot of requirements. Failing to do all these paperwork requirements also subjects the bank and the employee and everybody to potential liability in terms of, potential that you're involved in money laundering. This is for any bank, not just a municipal bank that would be set up. So because there's a lot of requirements that a bank has to monitor so closely and there's so much liability associated with it, the traditional commercial banks don't want to do business for the most part with cannabis-based banks because it's a cost-benefit analysis. At the end of the day, there's a lot of liability, and that's something that the city would have to consider should it decide that it wants to open a bank and do that type of transactions. I think that's it.
So, in City Attorney's Office's view, even under the Obama administration standards, a municipal bank would stand in the same shoes as a commercial bank would today, right?
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. That is correct, and we do think it's likely, if not, it's at least possible that the quote-unquote safe harbor of the FinCEN and the Cole memos, may be rescinded at any moment. It's not that you're immune from prosecution today. It's just that if you comply with these guidelines, and they're very detailed, and we're happy to go over it and give you an additional report if you'd like. It is, I think you guys have that information, but in the event that the Cole memo, the FinCEN memos are rescinded, then there is no way to do banking business with cannabis businesses.
Okay.
And I think that may be why you're finding that the state is also struggling with this issue in terms of how to deal with the deposit of money from the cannabis industry.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
I think we've covered it just in terms of the issues about the type of bank that we could deposit our money into. So there is a government code section 53635.2, which basically says that to be eligible to receive local agency money, a financial institution must receive an overall rating of not less than satisfactory from the appropriate federal supervisory agency. So for us to be able to deposit our money into a municipal bank, we would have to meet the approval of the oversight agencies. And my understanding is at this point as well that we would have to be able to receive FDI insurance.
Okay, so if some existing bank decided to, some rich guy came along and decided to open a bank, and it was a brand new bank, the city would be prohibited from depositing public funds in that because it hadn't yet established a track record in order to ensure a satisfactory rating, nor FDIC insurance. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's
So
correct.
a brand new institution, whether it's municipally started or commercially started, again, would be in the same boat. They wouldn't have established the necessary record to justify deposit of public funds.
Correct. They have to receive the rating from the federal oversight agency as required by state law.
Okay, so if instead we identified an existing financial institution that has long been in good standing, has long had FDIC insurance and satisfactory ratings. And we, hypothetically speaking, just decided to go buy it and put our own staff into senior positions and or the board of directors. What would stop us from being able to do something like that?
Well, I think the individuals that you put in would have to also satisfy the oversight agency that they had the requisite skill and ability to operate the bank. And another caveat I should note is there is a limitation as regarding credit unions, that members of an elected body cannot serve on the board of a credit union. It's unclear whether that would also apply if there were a bank. But again, I think we're trying to look and see whether that would preclude or prohibit if the city wanted to own and operate it, or the city wanted to serve as a catalyst for the creation of a bank, or we wanted to partner with another bank. I think there's variations on the establishment of a municipal bank, and we're happy to look at all of those. But as a preliminary matter, we think that in order to get the FDIC insurance and to get the appropriate approvals in place, you would have to have a track record, and so removing all of the employees or removing all of the board of directors, they'd have to be replaced by people who would be able to satisfy the experience requirements, and there's an open question as to whether or not it could be employees of the city or officials of the city. Okay. Oh, okay. I just want to add one thing.
Sure. I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing on that note. I do think, and again, we're getting well beyond the traditional area where municipal lawyers are well-versed. So we probably, at that point, to really answer your question, we would probably defer to some type of banking regulatory council. However, I do think that if you were to try to sell or buy a bank, that there is state and federal approval requirements. So in other words, if we were to try to sell, it's not as if you can sell a piece of property. The states or the feds, depending on the charter of that particular bank, would probably need to step in and, you know, at least be consulted and have some type of approval or veto over who you, in fact, transfer the bank to. Now, I'm not familiar with those procedures and what they are. Again, if you wanted to do that, we would be happy to look into it, but we probably would associate somebody in on that question because it's a very detailed banking regulatory question that we haven't, doesn't come up every day.
Okay.
I think this is a complex area, and we certainly are, you know, happy to look into the issue and provide our advice, but I think we also believe, and one of the recommendations we would have is that if the city wants to pursue this, that we look at the feasibility of engaging lawyers who are experts in banks and regulatory matters.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Mr. Wesson? Mr. Harris-Dawson? Mr. Blumenfield?
You were talking about credit union before. What are the advantages if we were to think about a municipal credit union versus a municipal bank? Could we do some of the things that we're talking about if we went that route?
So when you say do the things, I think with respect to the receipt of money from cannabis, I think you would have the same limitations in a credit union that you do in a bank. So if you're looking at, for example, making certain types of loans, or I'm not sure what the city would want to do, for example, with a credit union.
Well, you know, the thing that we talked about, there's sort of two, as the chair outlined at the beginning, two different issues. One is the cannabis issue, and one is all the other banking functions that the city has and trying to help with the unbanked and that kind of thing. Do we get around some of these banking restrictions by becoming a credit union?
Go ahead.
I believe for purposes of getting a publicly chartered bank, a credit union is a type of publicly chartered bank, so you would still need to go through getting a charter for that, and we would have the same problems getting chartered as a credit union as we would a different type of bank. You still have to get approval from the state. The other thing is, I think with credit unions, I'm not an expert in the area, you're limited to depository amounts of like $250,000. I think there's probably a financial lack of a fit for what the city might be wanting to do, but we could look into that further. But I think the credit union, there is a limit of $250,000, which I think that may or may not.
The biggest restriction with credit unions is there's an explicit statutory prohibition from having public employees serve on the board of any
There
credit
is.
union that accepts public funds. So we could, if we did it, we would have to give up any
Control.
ability to control it.
Exactly.
Because we couldn't have a public employee serving in a controlling function.
That is correct. And I think the other thing is with respect to, again, where the city can deposit its money, you're still living within the prudent investor rule, and then what that institution can do with the city deposits also.
And then on the cannabis side, Colorado, haven't they found a way to do some of this? And how are they getting around it? I mean, they have a credit union app that actually Hawaii is using.
I'm not that familiar with Colorado, other than I think they tried to establish a public bank, and I think that the latest that I've heard is that they've abandoned kind of that effort of establishing a public bank. You might be talking about how do they allow the banks to deposit money anyway? Is that what you're referring to?
So we've done some very quick research on that, so this may not be as detailed as it needs to be to answer your question, but it appears that there were at least two paths that were moving forward in Colorado. One is the fourth corner bank solution, which is discussed in the Polk memo that we should discuss with you further. And they had tried to establish a bank. They were rejected. Their application was rejected for the ability to access the Federal Reserve. And they tried legal action in order to overturn that decision, and they were not successful on that pathway. So that was trying to use the existing banking system in order to accept deposits from cannabis. The other solution is the Safe Harbor program that you just mentioned, and that was put together by it's a division of the Partner Colorado Credit Union. And they have put together what they say is a method to electronically monitor all of the steps of receiving funds and moving them around. And they say that it's compliant with the Department of Justice, the Cole memo, and the FinCEN memo. The concern, I think, is one, those memos can be rescinded at any time by the current administration, and two, I don't know that their methodologies have been tested. So I don't know that there's any experience yet of whether the Department of Justice or anybody else in the federal government has looked at these protocols and determined that they're effective. So it's a new approach, and it appears that it might be working. And as you say, Hawaii is looking at it as well. It's being marketed to other states that are moving into cannabis baking. But I think we need to do some more research and evaluation to determine where it stands.
And wouldn't it work better if we were, because the issue on that is being able to track all the dollars that are coming in, right? So that you can, because this is less about cannabis than it is about money laundering.
Yes.
And trying to figure out a way to, because that's where when I'm looking at this, the big federal hurdles are all around this money laundering issue. So if we were to go cashless and want to basically bank that ourselves, wouldn't that to some extent inoculate us if every dollar in the cannabis industry that was going into a dispensary and then they would in turn bank with us was accounted for because all other means were prohibited? Wouldn't that open up the door potentially for an easier route to banking cannabis?
That's certainly the way that Safe Harbor is approaching this, and I think we would need to look at this, and I think we would probably want to have somebody with some expertise in banking regulations look at it as well to give us a little bit more comfort on whether that satisfies the
I think that's true regardless I'm not the expert, but from what I've been looking at this a lot and from what you're telling me, that would be true whether we're the banker or whether some other entity is going to come in as a banker. If you take cash completely out of it, you make it a heck of a lot easier and less risky in terms of the FINRA and the federal money laundering issues.
Okay.
So if we were to be the banker on the cannabis thing, I think we'd have to go that way. But even if we want to encourage other folks to bank cannabis, it probably would help us tremendously to go that way. another question about the banks. So putting the cannabis side, of the side equation, other folks have created banks under the same law, like Puerto Rico. Now, they had a whole mess of problems because they didn't, and I'm not saying we should go down the Puerto Rican model because look at Puerto Rico right now, even before the hurricanes.
That bank is actually closing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that issue, their issues were more about the fiduciary responsibility and lending at, basically making loans that were economic development rather than fiscally responsible.
That's correct.
Right. So put that aside. But the fact is, they did figure out a way to legally create a bank. They didn't successfully execute it. But how did they get away with establishing? Because it was open for 20 years or something, right, or a long time.
The Polk memo is really rich in information, and it said that it was created in 1947. So it's been around for quite a long time. And the Bank of North Dakota was formed in 1919, I believe. So,
but that one seems a little less applicable because they're more a banker's bank.
Yeah, so they're definitely, both of those banks appear to be grandfathered into, it would seem, some of the regulations that we're dealing with currently, as though would be creating a brand new bank.
Okay, so they didn't, the Puerto Rican model, you're saying, was doing it from a grandfather clause,
That's my guess, because they were created in 47. So, we would have to do some more research into how that model evolved over time as banking regulations evolved. But since it was created over 50 years ago, 60 or 70.
And they weren't subject to California law with respect to deposit of money.
Yeah. So,
when you say California law, are you talking about the loaning of the credit issue?
So they would not be subject to California law with respect to what kind of institution can receive public money, public funds, and where the public entity can place its money, the prudent investor rules.
Okay. Great, thank you.
All right, anything else, members? Mr. West? Yeah, go right ahead.
On the state laws that are required to be changed in order to get us the possibility of a bank, is there legislation pending at all to do that we know of?
I am not aware of any legislation, but we did not research that issue, but it has not come to my attention that there's any effort to change the government code section.
And is it
we
different
checked
for
we didn't
an
find
infrastructure bank? I mean, the state has that.
I'm sorry?
Like an infrastructure bank, as opposed to doing the other kind of activities, in terms of deposits and those kinds of things. But having an infrastructure bank, would that be different in this regard?
I'm not exactly sure when you say an infrastructure bank, so if that would still be a municipal bank, it would just be formed for a particular purpose. But regardless, at this point, the issue is what kind of institution we can receive public money and what rules we have to follow in determining where we're going to put the public money. So if an infrastructure bank met those standards, then we could deposit our money there, but...
Because the state does that, right? Don't they have they have the iBank, and they do different types of infrastructure banking, but it's primarily for state projects?
yeah, we'll need to take a closer look at that. I'm not sure that it's a depository bank, so that might be one of the limitations in that structure.
Okay.
But we'll take a look at that.
I'd be interested in that, even though it's not the full Monty of what we're looking at. I'd be interested to know if there was more flexibility, if we were going down a more narrow corridor, or at least to start, like with an iBank of some sort. And I think other states have done infrastructure banks too.
The main question is that basically formed under the commercial banking structure? If it's not, there might be some other kind of structure that allows for the formation of that kind of entity, and so we'd have to take a look at that.
And you hit upon a point, Mr. Blumenfield that's kind of been a recurring issue, and that is until we, the council, more narrowly defines a specific mission that we hope to accomplish with this, it's difficult for the CLA and the city attorney to be able to analyze what the vehicle is or could be to achieve that end, because we haven't defined the end yet. So that's why we've done a little bit of, we've asked them to do a little bit of a scattershot approach so that we have the full range of possibilities, and I think we've kind of sussed some of those out a little bit. But in addition to infrastructure, the other thing that we've talked generally about in this committee is providing credit opportunities to the unbanked or to communities that don't have as much access to credit, to small businesses and to others. And maybe, Ms. Vincent, you could walk us through a little bit how we could achieve a goal, or whether we could achieve a goal of making loans to people that wouldn't otherwise be eligible for a loan by a commercial bank, for example, whether a business or an individual, and how that would affect our ability to maintain an institution like this.
So I think sort of separating out, if we were forming a municipal bank and if we were in a position to control it, the way in which we could make loans would still be governed by a prudent standard. So we would be basically subject to the standards that a bank would look at in terms of deciding who is eligible for a loan and what the terms of the loan would be. We do have, though, and have in the past, allocated funding through our budget process to assist small businesses. And an example that I can give you is some years back, the city received a grant from the Department of Commerce through the Economic Development Administration, and that was for a revolving loan program where funds were loaned to various businesses that were trying to start up, small businesses. And when the funds were repaid, they would be loaned out again. I actually think a really long time ago, we had a program as well through the federal government that allowed us to do that, several programs. I understand now that the city has allocated some funding to Economic and Workforce Development Department to reactivate the revolving loan program. So there are ways, assuming that we otherwise meet a municipal purpose, for us to, through the process, allocate some funding for these types of programs. If we were to try and do it through a bank, I think we're subject to another set of rules and regulations. But again, if that is what the council would like us to research further, we're happy to do that.
Great. All right, Mr. Bloomfield, and then I have a few suggestions for reports back. Go right ahead.
Yeah, no, and then I was just thinking, and it's kind of, we're kind of brainstorming here. When I was at the state, I did a loan loss reserve program with Treasurer then Lockyer. And it was specifically designed to deal with clean tech companies and their sort of what they call the valley of death, where they would lose their financing. And we did it through not a revolving loan, but a loan loss reserve program, where we put some money from the state aside, created this loan loss reserve, and that enabled the whole class of businesses to be able to get financed that couldn't otherwise get financed. So I don't know if there's something, as we're thinking of different options for banking more city folks, or for creating more financial opportunities for people who don't have it, if there's something like that we could do. Now that's not a bank, that's the Treasurer's office using banks and setting up, basically helping mitigate some of the risk, the more riskier loans, by creating this loan loss reserve. But that's another tool that I guess we could use as a financial tool we could use as a city if we can't get the full bank going.
Essentially acting like a cosigner to guarantee a loan to make that person more eligible to get credit.
Right, exactly, and having a certain rate of return where the loans that are successful kick in a little bit back into the loan loss reserve, so that it continues and it doesn't. It's not just about securing a few difficult difficult loans. It's about creating it's kind of like a revolving loan, but creating a fund that can activate more loans.
If I can just add
Sure.
to, my understanding is that EWDD is reaching out to banks to see, because the banks have obligations under the Community Reinvestment Act, to see if they're willing to provide some funding to what the city has available to assist the small businesses with the startup money or whatever it is they need. So that is another, I guess, possibility for the city to look at in terms of possibly expanding that program. But there is an effort afoot to try and get the banks involved.
Okay. Anything else, members? All right, then I'd like to request a few. Mr. Harrison? Okay. I'd like to request a few reports back. First of all, I'd like the CLA to report back at our next meeting on the legislative efforts in the state legislature relating to establishing public banks in California, and those would include the existing efforts that are going on now, the Treasurer's task force project that he's working on, but also recent, maybe over the last 5 or 10 years or so, recent efforts to enact legislation to eliminate barriers to municipal banking. I know that those have not been successful, but it would be useful for us to know what efforts there have been, because that will also tell us what's within the realm of possibility, I think. So if we have some of that... Exactly. Legislative efforts, even if failed, will identify the barriers, and that will be useful for us to know. So that would be helpful. I'd like to ask the city attorney to review this Davis Polk and Wardwell memo, as well as the Santa Fe legal memo, and report back to this committee with your legal analysis of the arguments contained in those. I'd like to ask the CLA to report back on existing economic development programs that are available to provide loans for small business development and startups. Just pretty much a laundry list of what we already have, so that we can consider potential improvements in those programs that might fulfill some of the objectives we're trying to achieve through a different route. Similarly, I'd like to ask the CLA, along with the CAO, to report back on the city's current process for financing infrastructure projects, with a particular focus on ways in which we might be able to do that more cost effectively or efficiently and reduce our reliance on private banks through public vehicles. And then finally, I'd like to ask the CLA, in consultation with HCID, to report back on current city programs that provide loans or guarantees for community development and for affordable housing. And again, with an eye to whether or not a municipal banking vehicle or some other public vehicle that we might initiate would allow that process to work more effective, more cost efficiently and effectively. Okay? Yes, Mr. Wesson.
I'd just like to put a little emphasis on something that the chair started out with. I want to make sure that you guys are crystal clear on this. The thought behind this is this feasible for us to create a municipal bank? Okay, I mean, I just want to go into this one more time. It is not creating a bank so that it could bank cannabis. That is something that kind of came along after. So when you're doing your research, you know, you shouldn't say, oh, if that they don't do this, it's because there's a cannabis component. No, let us know about the feasibility of the creation of a municipal bank and all of the other stuff. And I think you said it well when you started, but I just wanted to reiterate that it's about the bank.
All right, very good. Anything else, members? That's good. If there's no objection, it will be... Mr. Chair, will this be held in committee pending the report back? We would like to hold this matter in committee, and we'd like to get those reports that I just requested back at our January 24th meeting. If there's nothing further, members, is there any other business before the committee? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.